Hello, everyone. I know many of you are listening to this right now, tucked in somewhere warm, maybe with the lights already dimmed. Maybe with the glow of your phone the only thing keeping you company in the dark. I'm glad you're here. I'm always glad to begin tonight. I want to ask you something simple. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching or listening from. It doesn't matter if it's a tiny town or a big city, whether it's raining outside your window or completely still. I just love knowing that somewhere out there you're listening. And if tonight's story moves you, if it stays with you the way I think it will, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know. Now get comfortable. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow down. Let's begin. Johnsburg, Illinois is the kind of town that people from big cities drive through without stopping. It sits in McHenry County, in the northeastern corner of Illinois, about 60 miles north of Chicago. It's not far from the Wisconsin border. The landscape is flat in places, broken up by small lakes and patches of woodland. The kind of terrain that looks peaceful in summer and bleak and gray in winter. When the wind comes down from the north and doesn't seem to stop for months at a time. In 2002, Johnsburg had a population of somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 people. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, or at least knew each other's faces. Where the same families had been living on the same streets for 2 or 3 generations. Where the high school football team mattered, where church attendance still carried social weight, and where gossip traveled fast but consequences traveled slow. It was not, on the surface, the kind of place you'd expect to find organized crime. It wasn't Chicago. It wasn't a place with strip clubs and gambling dens and men in expensive suits making deals in back rooms. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that let certain things happen there for as long as they did. Because organized crime, real organized crime, the kind with deep roots and long memories, doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a bar owner. Sometimes it looks like a local businessman. Sometimes it looks like someone's dad. And sometimes it costs a 17-year-old boy his life. Brian Carrick was born in 1985. He grew up in Johnsburg, the son of Mary Weaver, a woman who by all accounts loved her children fiercely and tried to hold things together under difficult circumstances. Brian had siblings, a family that had its share of complications the way most working-class families do, and a life that was still being built, still being figured out, the way life always is at 17. People who knew Brian described him the way people describe a lot of teenage boys who are taken too soon, with a kind of gentle sadness, as if they're trying to hold on to the details before they slip away entirely. He was a kid. That's what you have to keep coming back to. He was 17 years old, he had friends, he made people laugh. He had the particular restless energy of a teenage boy who hasn't quite figured out what he wants to do with his life yet, but is in absolutely no hurry to figure it out, because life still feels infinite when you're 17. He liked hanging out. He liked his neighborhood. He had connections to people in the community, the way kids do when they grow up somewhere small, where everybody ends up knowing everybody eventually, where the social circles overlap and interlock in ways that adults understand and teenagers understand even less. And in the weeks and months leading up to December 2002, Brian Carrick had become connected in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to a man named Scott Vig. Scott Vig was not a teenager. He was a grown man significantly older than Brian, and he moved in circles that a 17-year-old boy had absolutely no business being anywhere near. He was connected, through a web of relationships that stretched back years, to figures in organized crime, specifically to the Chicago Outfit, the notoriously resilient and deeply embedded organized crime organization that had been a feature of Illinois' life since the days of Al Capone. The Chicago Outfit by 2002 was not what it had been in its heyday. The years of FBI pressure, RICO prosecutions, and internal conflicts had taken a significant toll. But it had not disappeared. It had adapted, it had spread its roots into suburban communities, into legitimate businesses, into the kinds of neighborhoods where people felt safe precisely because they believed that world was far away from them. Vig was one of the threads in that web, not a top boss, not a kingpin, but a man with connections, with obligations, and with the particular ruthlessness that tends to develop in people who have spent years operating in environments where violence is always a possible solution to any problem. What Brian Carrick had to do with Scott Vigg, exactly, what the nature of their relationship was, what Brian knew or had done or had been involved in, is something that would only begin to become clear years after Brian vanished. But the connection existed, and in December 2002, it became the most important and most terrible fact of Brian Carrick's short life. December in Johnsburg is cold. The kind of cold that settles in and doesn't lift, that turns the ground hard and drains the color out of everything, that makes the world feel smaller somehow, makes distances feel farther, makes warmth feel more precious. The nights come early and stay long, and by mid-December the darkness feels permanent, like something the sun has given up fighting. On the night of December 20, 2002, Brian Carrick left home. That detail alone, that simple, ordinary fact, would become the central mystery of the next several years. He left, and he didn't come back. There was no dramatic scene, no signs of a struggle at the house, no obvious last moment that the family could point to and say, "That's where it happened, that's the exact second when everything changed." He was there, and then he wasn't. He was 17 years old. His mother, Mary, would later describe the hours after Brian was supposed to be home as a slow building panic, the kind that starts small and quiet and then expands until it fills every corner of your mind. First the assumption that he was just late, then the phone calls that went unanswered, then the calls to his friends, the questions, the growing silence on the other end of the line, then the call to the police, and then the long wait. When a teenager goes missing, the immediate response from law enforcement tends to follow a predictable pattern. There's the initial report. There's the assumption, in many cases, that the teenager has simply run away, that this is a choice rather than a crime, a rebellion rather than a tragedy. There's the period of waiting, of watching, of hoping the kid will turn up at a friend's house or a relative's place, sheepish and embarrassed and unaware of the panic they've caused. In Brian Carrick's case, the days passed without any sign of him. No contact with family, no sighting by friends, no social media in 2002, no digital trail to follow in the way that would become standard in later years. Just silence. His mother filed a missing persons report. The police took it seriously enough to open an investigation. But what they found, what leads they had, what directions they could pursue limited. Nobody seemed to know officially where Brian had gone. Nobody came forward with clear information about the night he disappeared. The trail was cold almost from the beginning, and life in Johnsburg went on. People went to work. Children went to school. The holidays came and went. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a 17-year-old boy's disappearance began to recede into the background. The way things do when there's nothing new to report, when the police have no answers, when the days keep turning into weeks and the weeks into months, and still nothing changes. Except for his mother. For Mary Weaver, nothing receded, nothing faded. The question didn't get quieter. The absence didn't become ordinary. Every day that passed without an answer was another day of living inside a wound that wouldn't close, of waking up and reaching for a truth that no one would give her. Where is my son? The investigation in the immediate aftermath of Brian's disappearance did not produce answers. What it produced was frustration, the particular, grinding frustration of a case that seems to be surrounded by people who know more than they're saying, where the silence is the loudest thing in the room. 'Cause here's what investigators would eventually come to understand, what would only become fully clear years down the line: Brian Carrick hadn't run away. He hadn't decided to leave his life behind and start over somewhere else. He hadn't gotten into a car and driven off toward some unknown horizon. Brian Carrick had been killed. He had been murdered. Most likely on the night he disappeared or very shortly thereafter, by people connected to Scott Vigg and the broader network of organized crime that Vigg was embedded in. The exact circumstances of what led to Brian's death, what he had done, what he had seen, what obligation or threat had led to the decision that he needed to die, would take years to piece together. But the outcome was brutally clear: a 17-year-old boy had been killed, and the people responsible had the connections, the experience, and the absolute cold-bloodedness to make sure that his body was never found. That last part is crucial. Brian Carrick's body has never been recovered. To this day, more than 20 years after he disappeared, his remains have not been found. The people who killed him were careful. They were experienced. They knew how to make someone disappear in the most complete and permanent sense of the word. And for years, that completeness protected them. There's something particularly cruel about a case like this, something that goes beyond even the murder itself. When a family loses someone to violence and a body is found, there is at least the terrible, painful finality of it. There is a funeral. There is a grave. There is a place to go, a physical location where the grief can be directed, where the love that is nowhere else to go can find something solid to hold on to. When there is no body, there is none of that. Mary Weaver lived for years in a kind of suspended grief, a grief that couldn't fully land because the truth hadn't fully landed. Not officially, not legally. Because without a body, without physical evidence of death, Brian remained technically a missing person. A runaway for all the official record cared. Someone who had chosen to leave. The people who killed him understood this. It was in all likelihood part of the calculation. No body, no crime scene, no crime scene, no prosecution. No prosecution, no consequences. They had done this, or had been part of a world where this was done, enough times to understand the mechanics of it. But they hadn't counted on Mary. Mary Weaver did not accept the silence. She pushed. She asked. She refused to let Brian's case be filed away and forgotten the way missing persons cases sometimes are. Especially when the missing person is a teenager from a working-class family without political connections or public visibility. She kept talking to investigators. She kept demanding answers. She kept Brian's memory alive in every way she could. And she wasn't alone. Over the years, Brian's case attracted the attention of people who take a particular interest in cold cases, investigators, journalists, advocates for missing persons, people who look at a case like this and see not a dead end but a puzzle, not a closed door, but a door that hasn't been opened yet. Because here's the thing about organized crime cases that rest on silence and intimidation: the silence is never perfectly maintained forever. People talk. People make mistakes. The network that protected the killers in 2002 wasn't the same network in 2008, 2012, or 2015. People get arrested. People cut deals. People find themselves in situations where the value of information outweighs the cost of sharing it. And slowly, very slowly, over years and years, the truth about what happened to Brian Carrick began to surface. To understand what happened to Brian, you have to understand something about the world he had been pulled into, or had wandered into, or had been drawn into through connections that teenagers often don't fully understand until it's too late. The Chicago outfit's presence in Henry County was not accidental. Over the decades, organized crime had pushed outward from Chicago's urban core into suburban and even exurban communities, following the same patterns of population movement that characterized American life in the second half of the 20th century. Suburbs grew, money moved, and the outfit moved with it. It established itself in legitimate businesses, bars, restaurants, contracting companies that served as both fronts and genuine income sources. It built relationships with local figures, local politicians, local business people, creating the same kind of interlocking network of obligation and protection that had always been its operating model, just transposed to a quieter, more residential setting. Scott Vigg was part of that suburban extension. He was a man who knew people, who had relationships that ran deep into the organized crime world, and who operated in Johnsburg and the surrounding area with the particular confidence of someone who understands that his connections make him difficult to touch. When Brian Carrick came into contact with Vigg's world, for whatever reason, in whatever capacity, he was stepping into something he almost certainly didn't fully understand. He was 17. He saw a grown man with money and connections and a certain kind of authority that teenage boys sometimes find compelling. The way they find anything compelling that seems to offer power or status or belonging. He didn't see what was underneath it. The details of exactly how Brian came to be seen as a threat, or a liability, or a problem that needed to be solved permanently. are details that would emerge piecemeal over years of investigation. What became clear eventually was that Brian had either witnessed something, or knew something, or had done something that made him a risk to Vig or to Vig's associates. In the world of organized crime, the threshold for deciding that someone needs to be eliminated is disturbingly low. It doesn't require a major betrayal or a significant threat. It can be as simple as being in the wrong place at the wrong time and having a face that can be recognized and a mouth that could, theoretically, tell the wrong person the wrong thing. Brian Carrick was 17 years old. He was a kid, and in the cold mathematics of the world he'd gotten close to, that may have made things easier, in a horrible way. A 17-year-old boy is easier to dismiss, easier to minimize, less likely to have the resources or the connections to protect himself. They made a decision, and then they acted on it. December 20th, 2002. That date would become the fixed point around which everything else in this story orbits. The date of Brian's disappearance. The date almost certainly of his death. The last day that anyone who loved him saw him alive. What happened that night, specifically and in detail, is something that investigators pieced together over years from fragments, from witness accounts, from information provided by people who had been part of Vig's world and had later decided to cooperate with law enforcement, from the slow, painstaking work of building a case in the absence of the most essential piece of evidence, which was Brian himself. What the evidence ultimately pointed to was this: Brian Carrick was killed on around December 20, 2002. He was killed by people connected to Scott Vig. His body was disposed of in a way that made recovery impossible, or at least extraordinarily difficult. And the people responsible went back to their lives, confident that the silence they had created would hold. For years it did. In Johnsburg, December 2002 passed into January 2003. Winter deep and ground froze solid, the lakes iced over. The town moved through its ordinary rhythms: school, work, shopping, the slow drag of January after the excitement of the holidays. The gradual lightening that comes in February and March and signals that winter is beginning, finally, to loosen its grip. And Brian Carrick remained missing. The investigation continued in a technical sense. It was an open case, never officially closed, but open cases without new evidence don't generate new activity. They sit in filing cabinets. They're reviewed periodically and then set aside again. The detectives who caught the case moved on to other things, because other things always kept coming. The world didn't stop producing crime just because one case remained unsolved. Mary Weaver's grief didn't pause with the seasons. She thought about Brian every day. She kept his memory alive in the ways that a mother can, talking about him, refusing to let him become a name on a form in a filing cabinet, insisting to anyone who would listen that her son had not simply chosen to disappear. She was right. She had always been right. But being right in a case like this doesn't automatically translate into answers. It doesn't unlock the doors that other people have locked. It doesn't loosen the tongues of people who are keeping their silence out of fear, or loyalty, or self-interest. Being right in a case like this sometimes means nothing more than knowing the truth without being able to prove it. Living inside the knowledge that something terrible happened, while the world acts as if it didn't. That was Mary's life for years. The private certainty of loss without the public acknowledgement of it. Let me tell you something about what it does to a family when someone disappears and is never found. Not just the grief. Grief is something people understand, or think they understand, even when they haven't experienced it directly. The grief is one thing. What sits beside the grief, what makes this specific kind of loss different from other kinds, is the uncertainty. Because for a missing person with no confirmed death, there is always the theoretical possibility, no matter how remote, no matter how much the rational mind rejects it, that they're alive somewhere. That one day the phone will ring. That one day there will be a knock at the door, and on the other side will be the looking for, and there will be an explanation, and the wound will close. Mary knew, in the way that you know things that you can't yet prove, that Brian wasn't coming back. She knew he was dead. But there was no official confirmation. There was no body. There was no moment of finality, and so the uncertainty lived alongside the grief, making everything harder, making every anniversary worse, making every holiday season. And December was a brutal month, because Brian disappeared in December, a new collision with the loss. This is what the people who Brian Carrick stole from his family. Not just Brian. Not just his life and his future and every ordinary day that have come after December 20th, 2002. They stole the ability to completely. They stole the funeral. They stole the grave. They stole the finality. That too was part of the crime. The years passed, 2003, 2005. Each year without answers was another year the case grew colder. Another year the people responsible for Brian's death had more reason to believe they had gotten away with it. In the world of organized crime, getting away with it is both a practical outcome and a kind of proof of concept, evidence that the methods work, that the silence holds, that the network is strong enough to contain what needs to be contained. Scott Vigg continued to live in the area. He continued to move through the community. He had not been arrested for Brian's murder. He had not been charged. As far as the official record was concerned, Brian Carrick was still a missing person and Vigg was still a free man. But the FBI had not forgotten about Scott Vigg. The FBI's attention to organized crime in the Chicago area never fully switched off, even during periods when the outfit appeared diminished. Investigations built over years, with investigators gathering information slowly, developing sources carefully, building cases that were designed to hold up in court rather than fall apart under the scrutiny of defense attorneys who knew how to exploit every weakness. And as those broader investigations continued, as more and more people connected to the outfit's suburban operations came under scrutiny, the web began to tighten, not just around the major players, but around people like Vigg, around the mid-level figures whose crimes had seemed safely buried in the past. The first significant break in the case came not through a dramatic moment of discovery, but through the slow accumulation of intelligence that characterized FBI investigations. Someone, somewhere in the network, someone who had a reason to talk, someone who had found themselves in a position where cooperation was more attractive than continued silence, provided information about Brian Carrick. What that information was exactly, when it was provided, who provided it. These are details that became part of the legal record eventually. But in the early stages of the break in the case, what mattered wasn't the specifics of the source. What mattered was that the silence had cracked. Someone had told the FBI what they knew, or part of what they knew, enough to move the case from theoretical to active, enough to give investigators a direction, a name to focus on, a set of facts to test against the evidence they had or could gather. That crack, once opened, would over time widen into something that could not be closed again. I want to stop here for a moment and talk about something that gets lost sometimes in true crime storytelling, in the focus on perpetrators and investigations and legal proceedings. I want to talk about Brian. Brian Carrick was 17 years old when he died. He had been alive for 17 years, which means he had lived through a childhood and learned to walk and talk and read, had gone to school and made friends and had arguments and laughed at things and been afraid of things and loved people and been loved. 17 years is not a long time by adult standards, but it's a whole life by its own measure, a complete interior world, full of small private things that only Brian knew. He had a sense of humor. People who knew him remembered that. He had the particular social fluency that some teenagers have, the ability to move comfortably in different groups, to be liked without necessarily being the center of attention. He was, by the accounts of people who loved him, a good kid, not a perfect kid, because there are no perfect kids, but a genuinely good one. Someone who deserved better. Someone who deserved the full length of his life. He didn't get it. He got 17 years and then a December night that ended everything. He got a death that was kept secret. A disappearance that was maintained through lies and silence, and the calculated ruthlessness of people for whom a 17-year-old boy's life was simply a problem to be solved. And he got a mother who refused to forget him, who refused to let the silence stand, who kept pushing year after year, not because she had power or resources or official standing, but because she was his mother, because he was her son, because some things don't stop mattering no matter how much time passes. By the mid-2000s, The investigation into Brian Carrick's disappearance had expanded from a local missing persons case into something larger. Something connected to the broader FBI investigation of organized crime in McHenry County and the surrounding area. This wasn't unusual for cases of this type. What begins as one crime rarely stays isolated. It tends to be embedded in a network of other crimes, other relationships, other decisions that stretch back years. The investigators working Brian's case understood that to solve it, or to get close to solving it, given the absence of a body, they would need to understand the larger world he had been pulled into. They would need to understand who Vig was connected to, what operations he was involved in, what the structure of that particular corner of the outfit looked like in 2002 and in the years before and after. This kind of investigation takes time. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to sit with incomplete information for months or years, building slowly towards something that might eventually be prosecutable. It also takes people willing to talk. And in the organized crime world, people don't talk easily. The culture of silence omert, if you want to use the traditional term, though the Chicago outfit-specific version of it had its own flavors and variations, runs deep. People who cooperate with law enforcement put themselves at risk. They betray relationships. They expose themselves to retaliation. They break the fundamental code of the world they've been part of. But people do talk. They always eventually do. Fear works as a silencer. But it works less well when the thing you're more afraid of is spending the rest of your life in prison. Let me tell you about Scott Vig more specifically, because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened to Brian. Vig was, in the parlance of organized crime, an associate. A person connected to the outfit without necessarily being a fully initiated member. The distinctions matter in that world. A full member, a made man, in the traditional language, has been through a specific ritual initiation and carries a specific protected status within the organization. An associate has connections, has obligations, does work for the organization, but doesn't carry the same formal protection. What Vig did have was relationships. He knew people who were high up in the outfit's structure. He had been trusted with things, information, tasks, operations that required a degree of confidence from those above him. He was, in the language investigators would use later, a trusted associate with a history of violent crimes. That last part, violent crimes, is important. Vig's criminal history, which would emerge in detail through the legal proceedings that eventually came, was not limited to white-collar crime or drug operations. He had a history of violence. He was someone who had at other times and in other contexts been involved in or associated with acts of physical harm. This was the man that Brian Carrick, at 17 years old, had somehow gotten close to. This was the world that Brian had gotten close to. And when Vig or Vig's associates decided that Brian needed to die, there was machinery in place to carry that out. People with experience, methods that had been used before, a network capable of making someone disappear and keeping that disappearance a secret. The investigation continued its slow build. Investigators gathered information. Sources were developed. The picture of what had happened to Brian on December 20, 2002 became clearer. Not perfectly clear, not clear enough yet to bring to a jury, but clearer. The pieces were coming together. And then, in the late 2000s, things began to accelerate. Several individuals connected to the broader organized crime network in McHenry County were arrested on various charges. The kinds of arrests that create pressure, that give the FBI and federal prosecutors leverage, that put people in rooms and give them a choice between cooperation and a long time in federal prison. The kind of pressure that, in enough cases applied to enough people, eventually produces the information that investigators have been working toward. It was in this context, under this kind of pressure, that more specific information about Brian Carrick's death began to emerge. Not just that it had happened, not just who had been responsible in general terms, but the specific details. The what and how of it. The terrible, specific story of a 17-year-old boy's last hours. What investigators learned through the information that began to surface in these years was this. Brian Carrick had come to be seen as a threat, specifically, as someone who knew things he shouldn't know, who might talk to the wrong people, who represented a risk to Vig and to others in the organization. Whether Brian understood this, whether he knew that the people around him had decided he was a liability, is something we can only speculate about. But in the weeks leading up to December 20th, a decision had been made. On the night of December 20th, Brian was lured or brought to a location connected to Vig's world. There are different versions of exactly how this happened, how much Brian understood about where he was going, what he thought the night held for him. What is clear is that he ended up in a situation he could not escape from. He was killed that night. The specifics of how he died, the method, the location, are details that emerged through legal proceedings and were not made fully public in all their particulars, partly out of sensitivity to the family and partly because some details remained unclear even to investigators. What was clear was that his death was deliberate. It was planned. It was carried out by people who knew what they were doing. And then his body was disposed of. This is the part that has haunted the case for more than 20 years. The disposal. The deliberate, calculated effort to make sure that Brian Carrick could never be found, that his family could never have a grave to visit, that there would never be the kind of physical evidence that makes a murder case straightforward. They succeeded at that. His body has never been found. The search for Brian Carrick's remains, a search that has been conducted multiple times over the years, in multiple locations, by investigators using different methods and different pieces of intelligence, has so far produced nothing. This is not a failure of effort or technology or commitment. It reflects instead the sophisticated and deliberate nature of what with Brian's body after he was killed. This, too, is part of the story of organized crime that doesn't always get told. The logistics of it, the cold, practical efficiency with which the traces of violence are erased. The fact that this efficiency is itself a form of ongoing harm, not just to the family, but to the entire community's ability to know the truth, to have the truth confirmed, to have the loss acknowledged in the full and complete way that acknowledgement requires. Every year that passes without Brian being found is another year the people who killed him are protected, at least partly, from the full weight of what they did. Another year that the case against them rests on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence rather than on the incontrovertible physical fact of a body. Mary Weaver understood this. She had understood it from the beginning. The people who killed her son had taken not just him but the evidence of him. They had tried to erase him completely. She wouldn't let that happen. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a community when something terrible has happened, and no one is talking about it openly. It's not the silence of a place where nothing has happened. It's thicker than that, more deliberate. It's the silence of people who know, or who suspect, or who have heard things that they've decided it's safer not to repeat. It's the silence of a community that has learned over time that certain questions are better left unasked, certain names better left unspoken, certain nights better left unexamined. Johnsburg had that kind of silence around Brian Carrick's disappearance for years. Not everyone, of course. Mary never went silent. There were people who cared, people who remembered, people who kept the question alive in private conversations, even when it wasn't being asked in public ones. But the people who knew the most, the people who had been close enough to Vig's world to understand what had actually happened on December 20, 2002, those people were quiet in the deliberate, practiced way of people who understand what talking costs, and they stayed quiet for a long time. What began to change that wasn't a single dramatic moment. It wasn't one brave person deciding to stand up and tell the truth regardless of the consequences. It was the slow, grinding pressure of law enforcement doing what law enforcement does at its most methodical best, building cases, making arrests, creating situations where staying quiet becomes more dangerous than speaking, turning up the heat degree by degree until the choice between silence and cooperation changes its fundamental math. That process takes years. In Brian Carrick's case, it took the better part of a decade. To understand how the investigation developed, you have to understand something about how the FBI approaches organized crime cases. It's not like investigating a robbery or even a single murder, where you're working from a crime scene outward. looking for the person who did a specific thing at a specific moment. Organized crime investigations work differently. They work from the network inward. They start with the structure, the relationships, the hierarchies, the patterns of behavior, and they work toward the specific crimes that the structure has produced. This means that before investigators could build a case specifically about Brian Carrick, they had to build a broader understanding of the organized crime network that Brian had gotten close to. They had to understand who Vig was connected to, what operations he was involved in, what his role was in the larger structure of the outfit's suburban presence. They had to develop sources, people inside or close to that world who were willing, under the right circumstances, to share what they knew. The McHenry County area had been on the FBI's radar for years before Brian's disappearance, and it remained on their radar after. The outfit's presence in the area wasn't a secret to law enforcement, even if it managed to stay largely hidden from the general public. Investigators knew the names. They knew the connections. What they were building slowly was the documentary and testimonial evidence that turns knowledge into a prosecutable case. By the mid-2000s, that work was accelerating. The broader landscape of organized crime in the Chicago area was shifting: internal conflicts, aging leadership, the ongoing pressure of federal prosecution. And those shifts created opportunities for investigators. People who had been loyal to the outfit for years were finding that the protection they had counted on was less reliable than it had been. People who had stayed silent because silence felt safe were beginning to realize that silence might not be protecting them as effectively as they had believed. In that environment, people talked. One of the most important aspects of the investigation into Brian Carrick's death was the development of informants, people who had direct knowledge of what had happened and were willing to share it. In organized crime investigations, these sources are essential, particularly in cases where physical evidence is limited or absent. A case built on informant testimony is harder to prosecute than a case built on physical evidence, but it's not impossible. Federal prosecutors have secured convictions in organized crime cases on the strength of witness testimony alone. When the witnesses are credible, when their accounts are consistent, when the details they provide can be corroborated in other ways. The people who eventually talked about Brian Carrick were not, for the most part, doing so out of a sudden burst of conscience. They were doing so in the context of their own legal situations, people who had been arrested, who were facing charges, who had lawyers telling them that cooperation with federal investigators was their best path to a manageable sentence. This is how it works. This is the transactional reality of building cases against organized crime. The idealized version of the brave witness, who comes forward out of pure moral conviction, exists, but it's not the norm. The norm is people making calculations about their own self-interest and concluding, in enough cases, that talking is better than not talking. Whatever their motivations, what these witnesses provided was crucial. They gave investigators a narrative, a coherent account of what had happened to Brian Carrick, who had been responsible and why. Not a perfect account. Not an account that answered every question or filled every gap, but enough to build toward charges. Let me tell you what the evidence eventually established about the events of December 20th, 2002, and the days and weeks surrounding Brian's disappearance. Brian had, in the period leading up to his death, been involved in some capacity with Scott Vig and the criminal network around him. The exact nature of that involvement, what Brian was doing, what he knew, what role he played, was something investigators pieced together from multiple sources. What's clear is that Brian had become privy to information that people in Vig's world considered dangerous. He had seen or heard or been told things that, in the cold accounting of the criminal world, made him a liability. The decision that Brian needed to be eliminated was not made spontaneously. This is one of the most chilling aspects of the case, the premeditation of it. Someone, or a group of people, made a deliberate calculation that a 17-year-old boy's continued existence was more dangerous to them than the act of killing him. They weighed the risks and decided that murder was the safer option. Think about that for a moment. A 17-year-old boy, and the people around him doing the math and concluding that he needed to die. This calculation was made, and then plans were put in place. Brian was brought, on the night of December 20th, to a location where the people who had decided to kill him were waiting. Whether he understood what was happening when he arrived, whether there was a moment where the reality of the situation became clear to him, whether he was afraid, these are the details that the witnesses who eventually talked could not fully illuminate, and that we can only imagine. What we know is that he was killed. The question of how Brian was killed, the specific method, is something that emerged through legal proceedings with more detail than most people outside the case are aware of. It is not something I'm going to describe in gratuitous detail here, because Brian was a real person and this was a real death, and there are limits to what should be recounted in the name of telling a complete story. What I will say is that his death was not quick in the way that some deaths are quick. It was deliberate. It was personal in the terrible sense that violent deaths often are. And the people who carried it out were capable of it in the way that only people who have already crossed certain lines are capable of it. After he was killed, his body was disposed of. This part of what happened is, in some ways, the most clinically horrifying aspect of the whole case, the business-like efficiency with which the evidence of Brian's death was erased. The people responsible knew what they were doing. They had, in all likelihood, done things like this before or knew people who had. The method of disposal was chosen deliberately, with the specific goal of ensuring that Brian's remains would not be found. That goal was achieved. His body has never been recovered. Every search, and there have been searches in multiple locations, using every tool available to investigators, has come up empty. I want to talk about what it must have been like for Mary Weaver in those years, the years between Brian's disappearance and the moment when the investigation finally began to produce official, public results. Because this is a span of years we're talking about. Years during which she knew her son was dead, knew it in the bone, deep way that mothers know things, and could not get anyone to officially confirm it. Years during which Brian remained a missing person on paper, a maybe runaway in the official record, while she lived inside the private truth of his absence. Every missing person's anniversary is its own kind of torture. The first year is terrible in a raw, immediate way. The grief is still fresh, the shock still present, the hope still faintly alive even when the rational mind has given up on it. The second year is different. The hope is mostly gone by then, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. The third year, the fourth year, the fifth, each one adds another layer to the weight, and every December for Mary was a return to the scene. December was when she had lost him. December was the month his absence had its sharpest edge. Christmas without him. New Year's Eve without him. The whole season that the rest of the world associates with warmth and family and celebration. For Mary, it was the anniversary of the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She kept going. People who lose children to violence and don't get answers, some of them, not all of them, but some, find that the search for answers becomes the thing that keeps them going. The alternative to searching is accepting, and accepting is a kind of betrayal they're not willing to commit. So they push. They call investigators, they talk to journalists. They tell Brian's story to anyone willing to listen. They refuse to let him become a cold case statistic, a number in a file, a name that only has meaning to the people who loved him. Mary Weaver was one of those mothers. Brian was lucky to have her, in the terrible sense that a boy who was murdered at 17 can be lucky about anything. By 2008 and 2009, the investigation was producing results, not in the Brian Carrick case specifically, not yet, but in the broader organized crime investigation that the Carrick case was embedded in. Arrests were being made. Charges were being filed. The network that had operated in McHenry County with relative impunity was beginning to feel the weight of federal attention in a concrete, unavoidable way. This is the phase of an organized crime investigation that tends to produce the most dramatic results. When arrests start happening, when people start getting charged and start facing the reality of federal prison time, the calculus of silence changes. People who had been loyal their entire adult lives start running the numbers differently. They start thinking about how'll be when they get out. They start thinking about their families. their children, the life they'll be missing. And some of them start thinking about what information they have that the government might find valuable. The pressure was building. And in that pressure, more information about Brian Carrick was surfacing. Investigators had, by this point, a reasonably complete picture of what had happened. They knew Brian had been killed. They knew who was responsible. They had witness accounts, imperfect, self-interested, shaped by the circumstances under which they were given, but nonetheless pointing consistently in the same direction. What they were working toward was a case strong enough to bring to a grand jury, to secure indictments, to survive the scrutiny of a federal trial. Scott Vigg, during all of this, continued to live his life. This is one of the most difficult things to sit with when you look at this case. The years the people responsible for Brian's death simply continued existing, continued moving through the world, continued having ordinary days and ordinary nights while Brian had none. While Mary carried her grief and her certainty and her refusal to let go. There's something deeply offensive about that. Not in the legal sense, they hadn't been convicted yet, hadn't been charged yet, and in the eyes of the law they were still presumed innocent, but in the human sense. In the sense of sitting with what it means that a 17-year-old boy was murdered, and the people who murdered him went to sleep in their own beds, that night and every night after, for years, without consequence. This is not a unique situation. In cases involving organized crime, in cases where the perpetrators have the resources and connections to maintain silence, this kind of ongoing impunity is common. It's not an aberration. It's a feature of how this world operates, the protection that organization and silence and fear provide. But it means something. It means that for every year Brian was a missing person, the people who made him a missing person were free. They were eating breakfast. They were watching television. They were going about the business of their lives. They had taken Brian's future and they were living in it. That matters. The legal proceedings that would eventually bring consequences for Brian's death began to take shape in the early 2010s. By this point, the federal investigation had developed to the point where prosecutors felt they had enough to move. They had witnesses. They had a current account of what had happened. They had enough corroborating detail to build a case that could be presented to a jury. What they didn't have was a body. And this absence shaped every aspect of the prosecution's strategy. Building a murder case without a body is possible. It has been done. But it requires that the other evidence be especially strong, especially consistent, especially persuasive. Because the defense will always be able to point to the absence of remains and say, how do you know he's dead? How do you know this wasn't a disappearance? How do you know the witnesses are telling the truth? Prosecutors in federal organized crime cases are experienced with exactly this kind of challenge. They know how to build cases that don't rely on a single piece of physical evidence. They know how to present witness testimony in a way that makes the corroborating details, the things that witnesses couldn't have known unless they were telling the truth, carry the weight of proof. The case against the individuals responsible for Brian Carrick's death was built on this model. Multiple witnesses, consistent core narrative, corroborating details, the kind of interlocking testimony that makes it very difficult for a jury to conclude that everyone is lying or mistaken. Let me tell you about some of the specific details that emerged through the investigation, the details that filled in the picture. It happened on December 20th, 2002. And in the days leading up to it, in the weeks before Brian disappeared, there had been conversations that witnesses later described, about what to do with him. This is among the most disturbing things to emerge from the case, the idea that Brian's fate was discussed, planned, arranged in conversations that happened while he was still alive and unaware. That he was the subject of deliberations that ended in a decision about whether he would live or die. And that the decision was death. These conversations happened in the context of the broader criminal operation around Vigg. They involved more than one person. They were not impulsive. They were, as I said earlier, premeditated in the fullest sense. The people involved understood what they were deciding. They made the decision anyway. On the night he was killed, Brian was brought to a location. The specific location is something that has been discussed in legal proceedings, but not fully confirmed publicly, where he was met by the people who had decided to kill him. Whether Brian understood the danger he was in at that point is something we cannot know with certainty. Whether there was a moment where he realized what was happening, where the reality of his situation became clear. This is something that exists only in the accounts of the people who were there. People whose relationship to the truth of that night is complicated by their own involvement in it. What happened next was murder. Brian Carrick was killed on that night, December 20th, 2002, by people who had decided he needed to die and had made arrangements to make it happen. And then the work of disappearing him began. The disposal of Brian's body was, by the accounts that emerged through investigation, a deliberate and carefully executed process. This was not a panicked improvisation. It was not someone trying to hide a crime that had gone wrong unexpectedly. It was planned. The people responsible had thought about it in advance, had made decisions about how to ensure that Brian would not be found, and then they followed through on those decisions with a code efficiency that speaks to experience with this kind of thing. The specific method of disposal, where, how, under what circumstances, is something that investigators have information about, that has been discussed in legal proceedings, and that has led to searches in specific locations. Those searches have not produced Brian's remains. Whether this is because the disposal was so affected that physical recovery is genuinely impossible, or because investigators have been working from incomplete or partially inaccurate information about the location, or some combination of both, that question remains unanswered. What is clear is that the people responsible intended for Brian to never be found. They intended for his death to remain permanently deniable. They intended, in the most complete sense possible, to erase him. They underestimated Mary Weaver. And they underestimated the patience of federal investigators. In 2012, the investigation reached a critical point. Federal prosecutors had developed a case that they believed was strong enough to bring charges. They had witnesses prepared to testify. They had built the kind of evidentiary foundation that gives a prosecutor confidence going into a courtroom. The charges that were eventually brought in connection with Brian Carrick's death represented a significant moment, not just for the legal case, but for Mary, for Brian's family, for everyone who had spent years pushing against the silence and asking the question that no one in power had seemed willing to officially answer. It was, in a sense, the first official acknowledgement, the first moment when the state, the legal system, the prosecutorial apparatus, stood up and said formally, on the record, in the language of indictment, this happened. Brian Carrick was murdered. And here are the people responsible. That acknowledgement matters. Even in a case where the full truth remains incomplete, where the body has never been found, where every piece of the puzzle hasn't been located, the formal acknowledgement that a crime occurred, that a boy was murdered, that his life was taken, that matters enormously to families who have been living for years with the private truth of something that the public record hadn't confirmed. For Mary, it was validation. It was the legal system finally catching up to what she had always known. The legal proceedings that followed the charges were, as federal organized crime proceedings typically are, complex. There were multiple defendants. There were witnesses whose credibility would be challenged by defense attorneys. There were legal motions and delays of the kind that characterize major federal prosecutions. There was the long, grinding work of building a case in a courtroom, of presenting evidence to a jury in a way that makes the conclusion inescapable. Scott Vigg was among those facing charges connected to Brian Carrick's death. He was not the only person charged, but he was a central figure, the person around whom the whole network of responsibility radiated outward. His connection to Brian, his role in the decision to kill him, his position in the organized crime structure that made the killing possible, all of this became the subject of courtroom testimony, cross-examination, the adversarial process through which legal truth is determined. The defense strategy, as it typically is in cases like this, focused heavily on the credibility of the witnesses. The people who testified about what had happened to Brian were people who had been part of the criminal world themselves. They had criminal records. They had made deals with prosecutors. They had, by definition, their own self-interested reasons for cooperating. Defense attorneys hammered on these facts, as they are supposed to do, testing every account, probing every inconsistency, asking the jury to consider whether people like this could be believed. It's a legitimate line of defense. The question of witness credibility in cases that rely heavily on informant testimony is a real and important one. Juries have to grapple with it seriously. But federal prosecutors are experienced in presenting this kind of testimony, in building cases that can withstand exactly these challenges, in showing that when multiple independent sources tell a consistent story, the credibility attacks on any individual witness don't undermine the overall picture. The witnesses who testified about Brian Carrick's death were, as I noted, people who had been part of the criminal world around Vig. They had various levels of direct knowledge. Some had been present or involved in the events of that night. Others knew what had happened because they had been told about it afterward, because it had been discussed in the circles they moved in. Their accounts, taken together, painted a picture that was consistent in its essential elements even when it varied in details. A 17-year-old boy had been identified as a liability. A decision had been made. He had been brought to a location and killed. His body had been disposed of. The people responsible had gone back to their lives and kept quiet about it for years. This was the story that federal prosecutors presented. This was the story that the evidence, such as it was, supported. And this was the story that a jury was asked to evaluate. The trial itself, and the proceedings leading up to it, produced moments of particular emotional weight. Moments where the human reality of what had happened to Brian Carrick broke through the formal, procedural language of the courtroom. One of those moments was Mary's presence. She had waited years for this. She had pushed and refused to be quiet and kept Brian's name alive through all those years of silence. And now she was in a courtroom, watching the legal system finally engage with the truth of her son's death. It was not the closure she had originally hoped for. Brian's body was still missing. The most fundamental question, where is he, remained unanswered. But it was something. It was more than she'd had for a long time. The courtroom is not a place for grief in its rawest form. It's a place for evidence, argument, procedure, the formal mechanisms of legal truth-finding. But grief has a way of being present anyway, of being the invisible thing in the room that everyone can feel even when no one is directly addressing it. Brian Carrick's death was being adjudicated in that courtroom, and the grief of a mother who had waited years for this moment was present in every minute of it. I want to pause here and address something that comes up in cases involving organized crime, something that sometimes distorts the public understanding of what these cases are actually about. There's a tendency in crime stories involving the outfit or similar organizations to let the organizational drama, the hierarchy, the traditions, the internal politics become the main story. The romance of organized crime, such as it is, can pull focus away from the actual human cost of what these organizations do. The victims get crowded out by the mythology of the perpetrators. Brian Carrick was not a footnote in a story about organized crime. He was the story. A 17-year-old boy who was murdered because the people around him decided his life was worth less than their security. His death wasn't a subplot in a larger narrative about the outfit's suburban operations. It was a complete human tragedy in its own right, one that happened to be connected to those larger structures. Every time we talk about the organized crime angle, the FBI investigation, the network, the structure, we need to keep coming back to Brian, 17 years old, December 20th, 2002, a mother who never stopped looking for him. That's the center of this story. Everything else is context. The legal proceedings produced results. Scott Vig was convicted on charges connected to Brian Carrick's death. The specific charges, the specific counts, the specific legal framing of what Vig had done, these were the formal, official conclusion of years of investigation, years of building a case in the absence of a body, years of finding and preparing witnesses who had been part of the world where Brian had been killed. The conviction was a significant moment. It was the legal system saying, formally and definitively, Brian Carrick was murdered. Scott Vig was responsible. It was the answer, partial, incomplete in the ways that legal answers always are. but real to the question that Mary had been asking for years. It was not everything it couldn't be. Brian was still missing. His remains had not been found. The sentence that Vig received, significant, long, the kind of sentence that means spending a major portion of one's life in federal prison, was a form of consequence. But it wasn't the same as finding Brian. It wasn't the same as giving his family a grave. Nothing at this point could be the same as that. Vig was not the only person to face legal consequences in connection with Brian's death. The broader network of people involved, those who had participated in the decision, those who had carried it out, those who had helped dispose of Brian's body, those who had maintained the silence over the years, were subjects of investigation and prosecution as the case developed. This is one of the ways that organized crime prosecutions work differently from individual murder prosecutions. When the crime is embedded in a network, the legal consequences tend to be network-wide. Multiple people face charges. Multiple people are convicted or plead guilty. The accountability spreads outward from the central act to encompass all those who played a role in making it possible, carrying it out and concealing it afterward. Each conviction was another piece of the official record, another formal acknowledgement that Brian Carrick had existed, had been murdered, had been the victim of a deliberate and premeditated act of violence. Another small step toward the complete truth, even if the complete truth remained, in crucial ways, just out of reach. For Mary Weaver, each development in the legal proceedings was both a step forward and a reminder of what couldn't be recovered. The conviction of the people responsible for her son's death gave her something real and important and hard-won. But it didn't give her Brian. It didn't give her the answers to the questions that only finding him could answer. It didn't give her the ability to bury him, to have a place to go, to have the physical confirmation of the loss that the rest of the world already takes for granted when someone they love dies. The search for Brian's remains continued even after the convictions. This is something that doesn't always make it into the public narrative of the case. The ongoing effort, even after legal accountability has been achieved, to find him. Investigators continued to pursue leads about the location of his body. Mary continued to hope. The two things, justice through the courts and the simple human need to bring him home, existed in parallel. The first achieved, the second still out of reach. There is a detail about this case that I find myself returning to, that I think is important to understand if you want to fully grasp what happened and what it means. Brian Carrick was 17 years old when he was killed. The people who killed him were adults with full knowledge of what they were doing. They had made a decision, not in a moment of rage or confusion or diminished judgment, but deliberately, after consideration, in the cold and calculating way that the criminal world makes decisions about inconvenient people. They had decided that Brian's life was worth less than their convenience and their security. And then they had killed a child. Because that's what 17 is. Whatever bravado surrounds being a teenager, whatever sense of agency and independence and adulthood, in progress that 17-year-olds carry, it's still a child. Still someone who hasn't fully arrived at their own life yet. Still someone whose future was entirely in front of them, entirely open, entirely possible. They killed a child. And they tried to make it as if he had never existed. That's the crime at its core. Stripped of the organized crime context, stripped of the legal proceedings, stripped of the investigative detail. That's what happened. A child was killed by adults who decided his life didn't matter. And the people who loved him spent years fighting to make the world acknowledge what those adults had done. As the legal proceedings concluded, the convictions secured, the sentences handed down, the case against those responsible for Brian's death entered the historical record. It became part of what is documented officially and permanently about the organized crime presence in McHenry County in the early 2000s. It became part of what is known about Scott Vig and the people around him. But for Mary and for Brian's family, the transition from active legal case to historical record is not the ending it might appear to be from the outside. The legal chapter closed, but the human story didn't. Brian was still missing. Still no body. Still no grave. Still no place for the grief to fully land. The question that had defined her life years hadn't been fully answered. The legal system had done what it could do. The courts had acknowledged what had happened and punished those responsible. But the most fundamental thing, finding Brian, bringing him home in whatever sense that was still possible, remained undone. It remains undone today. There are people in this world who move through their communities wearing faces that don't match what's underneath. People who smile at neighbors, who shake hands at local businesses, who seem to all outward appearances like ordinary members of ordinary places, while underneath that surface, they carry the weight of things that would make those same neighbors recoil if they knew. People who have learned, over years of practice, how to separate the face they show the world from the reality of who they are and what they've done. Scott Vig was one of those people. For years after Brian Carrick disappeared, Vig continued to exist in the community. He had not been arrested. He had not been charged. There was no official mark on him, nothing in the public record that said, "This man is responsible for the death of a 17-year-old boy." He moved through Johnsburg and the surrounding area with the particular ease of someone who has done something terrible and believes, with good reason, given how long the silence held, that the terrible thing will stay buried. Understanding Scott Vig, not just what he did, but who he was, where he came from, how he got to the point where killing a teenager was something he was capable of, is essential to understanding this case fully, because Vig didn't spring into existence as a fully formed instrument of violence. He was shaped by a world and a set of relationships over years. He was a product of the particular culture of organized crime that had embedded itself in the suburban landscape of northeastern Illinois, a culture with its own rules, its own logic, its own brutal cost-benefit analysis of human life. Let's talk about that world, and about the man who inhabited it. Scott Vig's connection to the Chicago outfit was not a sudden thing. It didn't happen overnight. It developed over time, through relationships and associations that accumulated gradually, the way these things always do, through people who knew people, through favors asked and granted, through the slow process by which someone becomes embedded in a criminal network, and simply the context of their life. The Chicago outfit, by the time Vig was connected to it, was not the empire it had once been. The years from the 1970s onward had been hard on the organization, a series of major FBI investigations, the development of RICO statutes that allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individual crimes, the deaths of key leadership figures, and the internal tensions that develop in any organization under sustained external pressure. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, outfit was smaller, less visibly dominant, more careful about how it operated, but it was not gone. And it had not lost its fundamental character, the mixture of criminal enterprise and disciplined violence that had defined it since its origins. What it had done was adapt. It had moved some of its operations into less visible spaces. It had developed suburban presences that were harder for law enforcement to monitor and harder for the public to perceive as organized crime, rather than ordinary local business. McHenry County was part of that suburban spread. The organized crime presence there wasn't the same as what you'd find in certain Chicago neighborhoods, where the outfit's presence was long established and visible. It was more diffuse, more integrated into legitimate businesses, more dependent on relationships than on visible organizational structure. But it was real, and it operated by the same fundamental logic: money, power, and the willingness to use violence when necessary to protect both. Vig was part of that presence. He had connections to figures higher in the organization structure, connections that gave him both resources and obligations. He was trusted with things that required a certain level of confidence, which means he had demonstrated over time that he was reliable in the ways the organization required, that he could be counted on to do what needed to be done, that he understood the rules and would follow them, including the rule about people who became problems. The question that investigators spent years working through, what specifically led to the decision that Brian Carrick needed to die, was answered, in outline through the testimony of witnesses. The full answer is more complex than can be stated in a sentence, but the essential elements are these. Brian had been involved in some capacity with people connected to Vig's criminal network. Whether this involvement was willing or whether Brian had been drawn in, without fully understanding what he was getting into. And 17-year-olds are extraordinarily easy to draw into things they don't fully understand. Because adolescence is precisely the period of life when people are most susceptible to the pull of connection and belonging and the illusion of importance, is something that the record doesn't resolve with complete clarity. What is clear is that at some point, Brian came to know things, specific things that in the world of organized crime constitute a liability. The exact nature of those things, what he had seen, what he had been told, what he had participated in, is something that emerged through investigation in general terms rather than specific ones. What he knew put him at risk. And the people around Vig decided that the risk he represented was not manageable through any means other than eliminating him. This is the calculation that the criminal world makes, and it's one of the most important things to understand about how organized crime operates. It doesn't treat people as ends in themselves. It treats them as variables in an equation. A person's life, in this calculation, has value only insofar as it serves the organization's interests. When a person becomes a liability, when the risk they represent outweighs their usefulness, the equation tips toward elimination. Brian was 17. He had no power in this world. He had no protection. He had no way of understanding even if he sensed danger, the full extent of what he was facing. He was a variable in someone else's equation, and the answer the equation produced was his death. Let me tell you about some of the specific individuals who came up in the investigation, not just Vig, but the network around him that made what happened to Brian possible. Organized crime doesn't operate with a single person. It operates through relationships, through a web of people at different levels with different roles, different knowledge, different degrees of involvement. When Brian was killed, more than one person was involved. Some were directly involved in his death. Some were involved in the planning. Some were involved in what happened afterward, the disposal of his body, the maintenance of the silence. Each of these people was part of the network that protected Vig and the others from consequences for years. Among the figures who emerged through the investigation was a broader cast of outfit, connected individuals in the Henry County area. People who moved in the same circles as Vig, who had their own criminal histories, who were part of the same web of obligation and violence. Their names appeared in court documents, in indictments, in the testimony of witnesses who had been part of that world and had eventually decided to talk. What the investigation revealed across all these individuals was a portrait of a criminal network that had been operating in suburban Illinois with relative impunity for years. Not a flashy, cinematic, organized crime operation. Not the kind of thing that makes it onto the news because it's visually dramatic, but a real and functioning criminal enterprise that corrupted lives, generated enormous amounts of illegal revenue, and, in Brian Carrick's case, killed people when it decided they were inconvenient. The witnesses who testified in proceedings connected to Brian's death were, as I mentioned in the previous chunk, people who had been part of this world. Let me tell you more specifically about the nature of their testimony and what it established. The core of what witnesses described was consistent across multiple accounts. Brian Carrick had been identified as someone who needed to be dealt with. Conversations had taken place about this. A decision had been made. And on December 20, 2002, that decision had been carried out. One of the details that multiple witnesses corroborated was the planning aspect. The fact that this was not a spontaneous act of violence but something that had been discussed and arranged in advance. This detail matters legally because it speaks to premeditation, to the degree of intent involved. But it also matters humanly, in a way that is harder to articulate but equally important. Because the fact that Brian's death was planned means that there was time, days, possibly weeks, during which the people who had decided to kill him were going about their lives while knowing what they were going to do. They were making those plans while Brian was still alive, still unaware, still going through the ordinary motions of a 17-year-old's life. That gap, the space between the decision and the act, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the whole case. It suggests a level of compartmentalization, a capacity to hold the knowledge of what was coming and continue functioning normally. That speaks to the depth of the moral corruption involved in this world. There were also witnesses who spoke to what happened in the immediate aftermath of Brian's death, the disposal of his body, the efforts to clean up any evidence, the conversations that took place among those involved about how to maintain silence going forward. These accounts were crucial to the investigation for several reasons. First, they corroborated the core narrative, that Brian had been killed, that his death had been deliberate, that the people responsible had taken specific steps to conceal what they had done. Second, they provided details that investigators could use to assess credibility, the kind of specific, granular information that is hard to fabricate convincingly. That suggests the person sharing it was actually present or actually had direct knowledge of what happened. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they provided leads about where Brian's body might have been disposed of. Investigators took these leads seriously. Searches were conducted. Different locations were examined. Ground-penetrating radar was used. Every technique available to investigators looking for human remains was applied in locations that witnesses or the evidence pointed to. None of those searches found Brian. This is one of the ongoing wounds of the case. The legal case was built and argued and won. Convictions were secured. But Brian himself, the 17-year-old boy at the center of everything, remains missing. The evidence established what happened to him. The law responded to what happened to him. But the most basic thing, the thing that matters most to his family, remains undone. I want to spend some time with the search for Brian's remains, because I think it's an aspect of this case that deserves more attention than it typically gets. When we talk about unsolved or partially resolved cases where the perpetrators have been identified and punished, but where physical elements remain missing, there's sometimes a tendency to treat the legal resolution as the complete resolution. The conviction happened. Justice was served in the legal sense. The story, in terms of its formal narrative arc, has an ending. But for families like Brian's, that's not how it works. For them, the legal resolution is one chapter, and the search for remains is another, a chapter that may never close, but that matters as much as or more than the courtroom proceedings. Because finding Brian would give Mary something that no verdict can give her. It would give her the ability to bury her son. To have a physical place in the world that marks his existence. That says he was here, that he mattered, that his life was real. The searches for Brian's remains have been conducted in multiple locations over the years. Investigators have worked from the testimony of witnesses who had knowledge, direct or indirect, about where his body was disposed of. They have used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavation in locations that the evidence pointed to. They have conducted searches in rural areas, in areas near water, in places that the specific details of the case suggested were relevant. So far, nothing. The difficulty isn't just geographic or logistical, it's temporal. More than 2 decades have passed since Brian was killed. Time and weather and the natural processes of decomposition, and in some cases deliberate efforts to ensure that no trace remained, have made the task of locating his remains enormously difficult, even when investigators have a general sense of where to look. What might have been findable in 2002 or 2003 may not be findable now, not because it doesn't exist but because time has done its work. This is another dimension of the cruelty of what was done. Not just killing Brian and disposing of his body, but choosing a method and location that would resist the passage of time, that would fight against the family's ability to ever bring him home. Let me tell you about a specific detail that emerged through legal proceedings, a detail that I think illustrates, more vividly than almost anything else in this case, the depth of the moral failure that allowed Brian's death to happen, and allowed it to go unacknowledged for so long. In the years after Brian disappeared, while his mother was pushing and asking, and refusing to let the case be forgotten, while investigators were slowly building their picture of what had happened, the people responsible for his death were living in the same community. Some of them may have encountered Mary. Some of them certainly knew who she was, the mother of the boy they had killed, the woman who kept asking questions. And they said nothing. They looked at her grief or the idea of it, and they said nothing. This is not surprising, in the context of the world they inhabited. The culture of organized crime demands silence precisely because silence is survival. Talking means prison. Talking means exposure. Talking means the end of the life you've built. The individual human cost of that silence, what it means for a mother who doesn't know what happened to her son, is not part of the calculation. It never is in that world. But it should be said plainly, because it's important. The people who killed Brian Carrick, and the people who knew what had happened and stayed quiet, chose their own protection over a mother's grief. They chose their freedom over her right to know. They looked at what they had taken from her and they decided it was worth it. That is the full extent of what they did. Not just the murder. The years of silence that followed it. Scott Vigg's criminal history, which emerged in detail through the federal proceedings, was not limited to his connection to Brian Carrick's death. He had a documented history of criminal activity that stretched back years, a record that painted a picture of someone deeply embedded in the criminal world over a significant period of time. Violence was not foreign to him. The kind of ruthless calculation that led to Brian's death was not an aberration in his history, but an expression of a pattern that had developed over years of operating in an environment where violence was an accepted tool. This is important context because it addresses a question that sometimes comes up in cases like this. How does someone become capable of ordering or participating in the killing of a 17-year-old boy? The answer is that they don't become capable of it suddenly. It's a gradual process, a slow erosion of the ordinary human reluctance to harm others, enabled by an environment that normalizes violence, that provides justifications for it, that surrounds you with people for whom it is similarly normalized. By the time Vigg was involved in decisions about Brian Carrick, he had been in that environment long enough that the threshold for violence had been lowered to the point where a teenager's life was simply a problem to be solved. This is one of the most important things to understand about how organized crime actually works. Not the glamorized version, not the movie version, but the real thing. It operates by gradually normalizing the unacceptable, by building a world where certain things that should be unthinkable become, through repetition and context, thinkable, by creating a culture where loyalty to the organization outweighs every other human obligation, including the obligation not to kill people. Brian Carrick was a casualty of that normalization, of a world where his life had been reduced, in someone's calculation, to an inconvenience. The federal investigation that ultimately led to charges in Brian's case was, as I've noted, part of a broader effort targeting organized crime in McHenry County and the surrounding area. It's worth spending a moment on the scope of that broader investigation, because it gives context to why the Brian Carrick case took as long as it did to produce results. The FBI was building cases against multiple individuals, on multiple charges, across multiple years of criminal activity. Brian Carrick's death was one piece, an important piece, a deeply serious piece of a larger picture. The investigation couldn't focus exclusively on Brian's case without potentially compromising other cases, without tipping off subjects of investigation who weren't yet aware they were being watched, without sacrificing the broader accountability that the investigation was working toward. This is a reality of how federal investigations work that families of victims sometimes find deeply frustrating. The system is not designed to move as quickly as a family's need for answers demands. It's designed to build cases that hold up in court, that result in convictions, that produce lasting accountability rather than premature arrests that result in acquittals. The timeline is institutional, not human. It operates on the logic of prosecutorial strategy, not on the logic of grief. Mary Weaver had to live inside that gap between the institutional timeline and the human one for years. She had to wait for a system that was working toward the same goal she was, but working toward it at a pace that felt, from where she stood, unconscionably slow. That patience, the endurance it took to keep pushing, to keep Brian's case visible, to keep believing that the legal system would eventually produce something, is part of her story and part of what makes it so extraordinary. There is another dimension of this case that I want to address. The question of what it means for a community when it discovers that organized crime has been operating in its midst. when a case like this forces a town to confront the fact that the darkness was closer than it appeared. Johnsburg and McHenry County more broadly had to reckon with this over the years that the investigation developed and became public. The realization that a 17-year-old boy had been murdered by people connected to organized crime, right there in their community, was not an abstract piece of news. It was personal for people who had lived alongside those families, who had shopped in the same stores, whose children had gone to the same schools. There's a tendency when organized crime operates in suburban communities, for those communities to not fully see it, to explain away the signs, to extend the benefit of the doubt to people who don't deserve it, to prefer the comfortable interpretation that the darkness is elsewhere. This preference is human and understandable, but it has costs. One of those costs is that it allows people like Vig to operate for longer, to harm more people, to take more families before the reckoning finally comes. Brian Carrick's case is, among other things, a story about that cost, about what happens when a community doesn't see clearly, or chooses not to. About the 17-year-old boy who paid the price for a blindness that extended far beyond anything he could have controlled. Let me tell you about the role that Brian's case played in the broader federal prosecution, because understanding this helps clarify why certain decisions were made, why the case developed the way it did, and why the eventual charges against Vig and others were constructed as they were. In federal organized crime prosecutions, individual crimes are often charged as part of a larger pattern of racketeering activity. This is the logic of Reichseu, the Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allows prosecutors to charge not just the specific crime, but the pattern of criminal activity that defines the organization. When Brian Carrick's murder was incorporated into the federal case, it was charged as part of this larger pattern, as evidence of the organization's willingness to use violence to protect itself and its operations, as a specific act within a broader criminal enterprise. This framing is legally strategic, but it also captures something true. Brian's death wasn't an isolated act. It was an expression of a system, a set of values and practices and organizational logic that had been operating for years and that produced, as one of its outputs, the decision to kill a 17-year-old boy. Understanding it as part of a pattern rather than as a standalone act is, in a sense, more accurate. It situates Brian's death where it actually belongs, inside the ongoing operation of a criminal enterprise that treated human lives as expendable when they became inconvenient. The sentencing phase of the proceedings, the point at which those convicted faced the legal consequences for what they had done, was another significant moment in the long arc of the case. Federal sentencing in organized crime cases tends to be substantial. The sentences handed down reflected the seriousness of what had been done, the murder of a 17-year-old boy, the years of concealment, the obstruction of justice that the ongoing silence represented. For Mary, the sentences were a complicated thing. They were a form of justice, real and meaningful. They were confirmation that the system had seen what had been done to her son and responded to it with the full weight of the law. But they couldn't restore Brian. They couldn't give her a grave. They couldn't answer the question that still didn't have an answer. Where is he? That question remains. And as long as it remains, the case, whatever its legal resolution, is not fully complete. I want to talk for a moment about the role of the FBI specifically in this case, because I think the institutional persistence of federal law enforcement is one of the underappreciated elements of how justice eventually came to Brian Carrick's case. Local law enforcement handled the initial missing persons investigation. They did what they could with what they had in 2002, which wasn't a case with no crime scene, no body, and a community that wasn't talking. The limitations of that initial investigation are understandable, even if the results were frustrating. What made the eventual resolution possible was the FBI's sustained interest in the broader organized crime network that Vig was part of. Federal investigators have resources, time horizons, and legal tools that local law enforcement typically doesn't have. They can build cases over years rather than months. They can develop informants over extended periods. They can use wiretaps and surveillance tools that require federal authorization. and they can bring charges under federal statutes like RAIO that allow them to prosecute patterns of criminal behavior in ways that state charges don't always permit, without the FBI's broader investigation. It's quite possible that the Brian Carrick case would have remained an open missing persons file indefinitely. The connection between his disappearance and the organized crime network wouldn't have been fully developed. The witnesses who eventually provided crucial information might never have been in a position where cooperation became their best option. The legal case might never have been built. This is not a comfortable thing to say, because it implies that Brian's case and Mary's years of waiting were in some sense dependent on the institutional priorities of federal law enforcement. But it's true, and it's worth acknowledging because it says something important about the relationship between organized crime and the communities it operates in, and about the role of sustained federal enforcement attention in exposing that relationship. As the legal proceedings concluded and the sentences were handed down, the public narrative of the Brian Carrick case underwent a shift. It moved from the category of unsolved mystery, a missing teenager, a cold case, to the category of resolved tragedy. The people responsible had been identified, charged, convicted, and sentenced. The broad outlines of what had happened were now part of the public record, but resolution is a complicated word in a case like this. It suggests completion, and there is no completion here. Not while Brian remains missing. Not while his family still can't answer the question of where he is. Not while the most basic thing, bringing him home, remains undone. In the years since the convictions, the search for Brian's remains has continued. Investigators have followed leads. Family advocates have pushed for renewed searches. Every few years there are reports of new efforts in new locations, new applications of forensic technology, new information from new sources. So far nothing has produced Brian. This is the ongoing wound. The case that was resolved in the courtroom but wasn't resolved in the most human sense. The justice that was achieved but wasn't complete. Let me tell you something about the specific geography of the searches for Brian's remains, because the places that investigators have focused on tell us something about what witnesses and evidence suggested about the disposal. Without going into the specific details that investigators have kept partially confidential, details that remain sensitive because the search is still, in a technical sense, ongoing. What emerged through legal proceedings was a general picture of the type of disposal that had been used. It involved a location that was not in the immediate vicinity of where Brian was killed, suggesting that his body was moved. It involved a method of disposal designed to be permanent, to resist the work of time and forensic investigation. The rural character of Henry County, the lakes, the wooded areas, the farmland, provides the kinds of locations that people trying to dispose of a body permanently tend to look for. Remote enough to be unobserved. Stable enough, in the geological sense, to hold something indefinitely if the concealment is done properly. Close enough to the area of operation to be practical. This geography has shaped the searches. Investigators have worked through locations that match the general description that the evidence suggests. They have searched areas near water. They have searched rural parcels. They have searched in places that specific witness accounts pointed to. The ground has not given Brian back. There is one more thing I want to address in this chunk before we move forward. Something that has to do with legacy, with what Brian Carrick's case means beyond the specific facts of what happened to him. Cases like Brian's, cases involving the murder of young people by organized crime, cases where the body was never found, cases that took years to resolve legally and remain unresolved in the most human sense, have the potential to change things, to change how law enforcement responds to missing persons cases in communities where organized crime is present, to change how communities understand the risk that criminal networks operating in their midst pose to ordinary people, to change how families of missing persons are treated by the institutions they turn to for help. Whether Brian's case has produced those changes in any measurable way is something I can't say with certainty. What I can say is that his case, and cases like it, are part of an ongoing argument for sustained attention to organized crime, not as an abstraction, not as a sociological phenomenon or a historical legacy, but as a present threat to real people and real communities. A threat that takes lives, that takes children. That takes the future of 17-year-old boys and turns it into a question that a mother asks for the rest of her life. Brian Carrick deserves to be remembered as more than a case study. He deserves to be remembered as a person, as a specific, irreplaceable human being whose life was taken before he had a chance to find out who he was going to become. He deserves that, at minimum. And the people who loved him deserve to find him. There is a moment in every long fight when the person fighting it has a choice that most people never have to make. Not the choice to start. That choice is often made for you, by circumstances, by loss, by the simple fact that something happened that you can't ignore. The choice I'm talking about comes later. It comes when the fight has been going on long enough that exhaustion is real, when the initial urgency has faded into something chronic and grinding, when the world around you has largely moved on, and you're still standing in the same place asking the same question. The choice is whether to keep going. Mary Weaver made that choice over and over, for more than a decade. She chose to keep going when investigators had no new leads. She chose to keep going when Brian's case was not in the news, not on anyone's radar, not generating the kind of attention that produces results. She chose to keep going when the silence from the people who knew the truth was total, when every avenue she tried seemed to end in a wall, when keeping Brian's memory alive meant doing it almost entirely alone. This is not a small thing. This is an enormous thing. The kind of endurance that Mary demonstrated is the kind that doesn't get the attention it deserves, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like a woman making phone calls. It looks like a mother talking to investigators who may or may not be listening. It looks ordinary from a distance. From up close, it's one of the most extraordinary things a human being can do. She kept going, and because she kept going, the people who killed her son did not get to disappear into the comfortable certainty that they had won. Let me go back to the specific timeline of the legal proceedings, because I want you to understand not just that charges were eventually brought and convictions secured, but the specific shape of how that happened, the specific moments where the case moved from investigation to prosecution, from prosecution to verdict, from verdict to sentencing. Understanding this timeline matters because it's the framework inside which Mary lived for years. It's the structure of the long fight. And it's the story of how a case that seemed for a long time like it might never produce accountability eventually did. The broader federal investigation into organized crime in Henry County had been developing through the 2000s. By the late 2000s, it had produced a series of arrests and charges that began to reshape the landscape of who was willing to talk and who wasn't. The key development, the development that directly enabled the case against those responsible for Brian's death to move forward, was the emergence of cooperating witnesses who had specific, direct knowledge of what had happened to Brian. Getting to those witnesses wasn't simple. It required building relationships over time. It required the kind of patient, sustained engagement that federal investigators develop with potential sources, the process of understanding someone's situation, understanding their motivations, understanding what they need and what they can offer, and finding the point where cooperation becomes their best available option. That process is not fast, and it is not clean. The people who ultimately provided the most important testimony about Brian's death were not heroes. They were people who had been part of the same world that had produced his murder. They had their own criminal histories. They had their own reasons for eventually talking, reasons that were, for the most part, rooted in self-interest rather than conscience. But their testimony was real. It was corroborated. And it was the foundation on which the legal case was built. The specific charges brought in connection with Brian Carrick's death were federal charges, reflecting the organized crime context in which the murder occurred. The central charge, the one that most directly addressed what had been done to Brian, was murder in aid of racketeering, which under federal law allows prosecutors to charge a killing that was carried out in connection with or in furtherance of racketeering activity. This legal framing is important for several reasons. First, it acknowledges the connection between Brian's death and the organized crime enterprise, it says, formally, that this wasn't just a murder. It was a murder committed as part of a criminal organization's operation. Second, it carries significant sentencing implications, because federal murder charges in aid of racketeering can carry sentences up to life in prison. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the prosecution's strategy, it allowed prosecutors to present the broader context of the criminal enterprise to the jury. They weren't just presenting the specific facts of December 20th, 2002. They were presenting the world that produced those facts, the organization, the hierarchy, the culture of violence, the specific logic that had led to the decision that Brian needed to die. The jury would understand not just what happened but why, in the terrible, systemic sense. This broader context mattered for the strength of the prosecution's case. Because the physical evidence was limited, there was no body, there was no crime scene that had been preserved, there was no forensic trail of the kind that anchors many murder prosecutions. The prosecution needed the narrative to carry weight. It needed the jury to understand the world fully enough to see how the individual acts fit together into a coherent picture of premeditated murder. Scott Vigg faced the most serious charges in connection with Brian's death. His role, as the central figure around who the network of responsibility was organized, as the person whose decision-making was at the heart of what happened, put him in the position of primary defendant. The case against him was built on the testimony of multiple witnesses, each providing pieces of the overall picture, each corroborating key elements of the other's accounts. His defense, as I touched on earlier, focused significantly on the credibility of those witnesses. The argument was straightforward: these are criminals. They have made deals with the government. They have every reason to say what the government wants them to say. You cannot convict a man of murder on the word of people who are themselves criminals, who have their own crimes to answer for, who are testifying in exchange for reduced sentences. It's an argument that defense attorneys make regularly in these kinds of cases, and it's an argument that sometimes works. Juries are not always willing to trust informants. The inherent credibility problems of people who have made deals with prosecutors are real, and defense attorneys are skilled at making those problems vivid for jurors. But the prosecution's case was built to withstand exactly this challenge. Multiple witnesses, consistent core narrative, corroborating details that each witness could only have known if their accounts were based on actual knowledge of what happened. The kind of interlocking testimony where the pieces fit together in ways that are very difficult to explain if everyone is lying or confused. The jury ultimately was persuaded. The verdict reflected the weight of that testimony and the coherence of the picture it painted. The verdict itself, the moment when it came, after all the years of investigation and all the months of legal proceedings, was a moment that I want to describe carefully, because I think it deserves more than a simple statement of the legal outcome. For Mary Weaver, it was the first time that the legal system had formally, officially, beyond any procedural ambiguity, stated that her son had been murdered, that he had not run away, that he had not chosen to disappear, that he had been killed deliberately and premeditatedly by people who had decided his life was not worth protecting. The legal system had said, "You were right. You were right all along. Your son did not leave. Your son was taken. And the people who took him are going to be held accountable." This is not nothing. In a world that had, for years, maintained the procedural fiction that Brian was simply a missing person, a fiction that, whatever its legal technicality, had the effect of leaving open the possibility that he had chosen to go, that the people responsible bore no legal culpability. The verdict was the closing of that fiction. It was the truth stated officially in the language of the law. It was not everything. Brian was still missing. The wound was not closed, but it was something that no amount of subsequent silence or denial could undo. The record now reflected what had actually happened. The sentencing that followed the verdict was, as federal sentencing in organized crime murder cases tends to be, substantial. The judge in these proceedings had the full picture of what Vigg had done. Not just Brian's death, but the pattern of criminal activity that surrounded it, the years of silence and concealment, the ongoing harm that the refusal to cooperate with the search for Brian's remains represented. Federal sentences in cases like this are long. They're designed to reflect the full gravity of what was done, not just the specific crime, but the organizational violence that it was part of, the culture of harm that it expressed and reinforced. The sentence handed down to Vig placed him in federal prison for a significant period of time. The kind of sentence that, for a person of the age at which he was convicted, effectively means spending a major portion of the rest of their life incarcerated. For Mary, the sentence was another complicated thing. Not simple satisfaction, not the clean, complete feeling that the word justice sometimes implies. Something more tangled, the recognition that consequences had come, that the law had done what it could do, alongside the knowledge that what it could do still didn't reach the heart of what she needed. She still didn't have Brian. I want to talk about the other people who faced consequences in connection with Brian's death, because Vig was not the only one, and the broader accountability that the case produced as part of its story. The organized crime investigation that encompassed Brian's case resulted in charges against multiple individuals connected to the Mahangary County network. Some of these charges were directly related to Brian's murder. Others were related to the broader pattern of criminal activity, the extortion, the illegal gambling operations, the drug trafficking, the violence that was part of the outfit's suburban presence. Together, the prosecutions produced a significant dismantling of the specific network that had allowed Brian's murder to be planned, carried out, and concealed. Among those who faced charges were people who had been involved in the planning of Brian's death, people who had been part of the conversations about what to do about him, who had contributed to the decision that he needed to be eliminated. Others faced charges related to the disposal of his body, the deliberate effort to ensure he was never found. Still others were charged in connection with the broader pattern of organized crime activity that the investigation had developed. Each of these prosecutions added to the public record. Each one was another piece of the truth being formally stated, officially recorded, made part of the legal history of what had happened in Henry County in those years. None of them found Brian. Let me tell you about something that happened in the years after the convictions. Something that speaks to the ongoing nature of the search, and to Mary's refusal to accept that the legal resolution of the case was the final word on finding her son. With the people responsible for Brian's death in federal prison, investigators and family advocates continued to push for information about where Brian's remains had been disposed of. This is one of the ways that the leverage of incarceration can sometimes produce results in cases like this. People serving long sentences have time to think about things. They have time to consider what information they might have that could be of value. They have time to weigh the question of whether maintaining silence about the location of a boy's body is worth the ongoing cost of that silence, whether it's something they want to carry for the rest of their lives. In some cases, information does emerge from people serving sentences in cases like this. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes the passage of time, the reality of incarceration, the opportunity for whatever reflection a person is capable of, produces a willingness to share what they know. Whether that has happened in Brian's case, whether anyone serving a sentence related to his death has provided information that has led or could lead to his remains, is something that is not fully in the public record. What is clear is that the search has not officially been abandoned. It continues in whatever form current investigative resources and leads allow. Mary has not given up. There is a concept in grief literature, in the academic and clinical literature about how people process loss, called ambiguous loss. It was developed by a researcher named Pauline Boss, and it refers to a specific kind of grief that arises when the loss is not clear-cut, when the person is gone in one sense but not confirmed gone in another, when the absence is real but not officially complete. The clearest examples of ambiguous loss are cases exactly like Brian Carrick's. A person who has disappeared, who is almost certainly dead, but whose death has not been physically confirmed. A person who is gone from the life of the people who love them, but who doesn't have a grave, doesn't have a confirmed end, doesn't have the kind of concrete finality that allows grief to do its work and eventually settle into something livable. Ambiguous loss produces a specific kind of suffering, different from the suffering of a confirmed death, in some ways harder to process. There's no clear moment to grieve from. There's no body to bury. There's no ritual, the funeral, the burial, the physical gathering of people around a grave. That marks the end and begins the work of going on. The loss just exists, suspended, never fully resolved, never fully allowed to become the past. This is what Mary Weaver has lived with. Not just grief but ambiguous loss, the specific, grinding, impossible experience of loving was gone but not officially gone, of carrying a wound that can't fully close because the information that would close it has been deliberately withheld. The people who disposed of Brian's body understood, perhaps not in clinical terms but in practical ones, exactly what they were doing. They were not just concealing evidence. They were inflicting a permanent injury on the people who loved him. They were ensuring that even if they were eventually caught, even if the legal system eventually held them accountable, they would retain the power to hurt Mary Weaver indefinitely. As long as Brian's body remained hidden, they held the key to the one thing she needed most. That is a form of ongoing violence. It is less visible than the original murder, less dramatic. But it is real and it has been sustained for more than 20 years. I want to spend time on the witnesses, specifically on what it must have been like to be someone who knew what had happened to Brian, and was eventually asked to testify about it. These were not, as I've said, people who came forward out of pure moral courage. They were people in difficult legal situations who made calculations about their own self-interest. But I don't want to leave it entirely at that, because I think the full picture is more complicated. Some of these individuals had known Brian, had known him as a person, not just as a name or a problem or a variable in someone's criminal calculation. Some of them had been close enough to what happened to understand, in the moments it was happening, that a specific human being was being killed, not an abstraction, not a liability, but a 17-year-old boy with a face and a family that would spend years looking for him. Whatever that knowledge did to them in the years that followed, whether they had nightmares about it, whether they thought about it, it sat in the back of their minds as an unresolved thing. We don't fully know. What we know is that eventually some of them talked. Eventually, some of them chose to step out of the silence and tell what they knew. I'm not interested in making heroes of people who waited years to provide information they could have provided sooner. But I'm also not interested in reducing the complexity of what it means to carry that kind of knowledge in a world where talking about it is genuinely dangerous. These were people who had made terrible choices, who had been part of terrible things, who were navigating the impossible terrain of their own culpability and their own fear. Their testimony helped build the case that produced accountability for Brian's death. Whatever their motivations, that is real and it mattered. The broader impact of the case on McHenry County, on the organized crime presence in the area, on the community's understanding of what had been operating in its midst, is something worth examining. Federal prosecutions of organized crime networks don't eliminate organized crime. They disrupt specific networks, specific relationships. They incarcerate specific people. But the underlying conditions that allow organized crime to develop, the economic pressures, the social dynamics, the cultural factors, don't disappear because a specific network has been dismantled. New networks form. New relationships develop. The business of organized crime continues, just reorganized around different people and different structures. What the prosecutions in McHenry County did do was remove specific individuals from the community, individuals who had been sources of harm for years, whose removal made the community genuinely safer in ways that are hard to quantify but real. The specific network that had allowed Brian Carrick's murder to be planned and carried out and concealed was broken. The specific individuals responsible were in federal prison. For the community, this was a reckoning, a forced acknowledgement that the darkness had been closer than it appeared, that the people who had seemed like ordinary members of the community, business people, neighbors, people you saw at the local bar or the local hardware store, had been part of something that included the murder of a 17-year-old boy. That knowledge changes a community. not always in ways that are visible or dramatic. But it changes the way people understand their own place, their own history, the gap between the surface of things and what can lie underneath. Mary Weaver became, in the years after the convictions, an advocate, not just for Brian specifically, but for other families in similar situations, families of missing persons, families who had lost people to violence and were waiting for answers, families navigating the particular hell of ambiguous loss in the context of criminal investigations that moved slowly and produced incomplete results. Her advocacy was not loud or public in the way that some victims' advocates become public figures. It was quieter than that, more personal. But it was real, and it was rooted in everything she had learned through the years of fighting for Brian, about how the system works, about what families need, about the gaps between what law enforcement can do and what families actually require. She had become, through the worst possible education, an expert in loss. In the specific kind of loss that comes when someone is taken deliberately and hidden. In the kind of fighting that doesn't end when the legal system produces a verdict. In the kind of love that doesn't stop asking questions, even when the questions have no answers. Let me tell you something specific about the search for Brian that happened in the years after the convictions. A search that generated particular attention and particular heartbreak. In the years following the legal resolution of the case, investigators conducted at least one significant search operation in a location that evidence and witness accounts had evidenced to as a possible site where Brian's remains had been disposed of. This search involved substantial resources, specialized equipment, forensic expertise, the kind of organized effort that reflects a serious, committed attempt to find what had been hidden. The search found nothing, or nothing that resolved the question of Brian's location. The emotional weight of those moments, when a search concludes without finding Brian, is difficult to convey fully. They are moments of renewed grief, of hope that rises and then collapses, of having to once again pick up the weight of not knowing and carry it forward. For Mary, each search that doesn't find Brian is another instance of the same unanswerable question being asked and going unanswered. Another year of carrying something that should have been set down years ago. The people who killed Brian and hid him gave her this specific ongoing suffering, this permanent state of searching. I want to circle back to Brian himself, because in the midst of all this, the legal proceedings, the organizational context, the investigation and its methods, it's easy to let him recede into the background of his own story. He shouldn't recede. He should be the center of it. Brian Carrick was born in 1985. He would be in his late 30s now had he lived. He would have had a whole adult life, the years between 17 and now. More than 2 decades of ordinary and extraordinary days. He would have had relationships, maybe a family of his own, work that he found meaningful or frustrating or both. The kind of accumulated experience that makes a person who they are. He would have grown up in whatever direction growing up took him. He didn't get any of that. He got 17 years and then December 20th, 2002. What he would have become is something that exists only in the imagination of the people who loved him, in Mary's imagination. In the imagination of his siblings and friends, and the people who knew him when he was alive. The Brian Carrick who would have been is as much a part of the loss as the Brian who was. The future that was stolen is as real a thing as the past that was lived. This is what murder takes. Not just the life as it was, but the life as it would have been. Every birthday that didn't happen. Every Christmas that was different because he wasn't there. Every ordinary Tuesday that was hollowed out by his absence. 20+ years of them. The people who killed Brian Carrick didn't just end his life on December 20th, 2002. They took everything that was going to come after it. Every single thing. As we approach the end of what we know officially about the case, the legal record, the documented history, the public facts, I want to spend a moment with what remains unknown. Brian's body has not been found. This is the central remaining unknown, where he is specifically, what the precise circumstances of the disposal were, whether his remains are in a condition where they could be identified and returned to his family. The witnesses who testified about Brian's death provided information about the disposal, general information, directional information. Whether that information is accurate enough and specific enough to produce a successful search. Whether the location has changed in the more than 20 years since 2002 in ways that make physical recovery impossible. Whether additional information might emerge that could narrow the search. These are the open questions. There are also questions about the full decision making that led to Brian's death, questions about who exactly was involved at every level, about what Brian specifically knew that made him a target, about the precise chain of events that led from his connection to Vig's world to his death. The legal record established the broad outlines, but the specific details of the interior of that decision-making, the conversations, the specific information Brian possessed, the exact sequence of events, remain partially in shadow. These are not questions that the convictions answered fully. They're questions that live in the space between the legal resolution and the human truth, in the gap between what the law can establish and what a mother needs to know. There is something I have been thinking about through the telling of this story. Something that I want to say directly, even though it's the kind of thing that true crime storytelling doesn't always make space for. We tell these stories for many reasons. We tell them because they're compelling, because they involve mystery and investigation, and the particular human drama of crime and consequence. We tell them because they illuminate something about the world, about the organizations that operate in it, the people who populate it, the systems that respond to it. But the most important reason to tell a story like Brian Carrick's is this, so that Brian himself is not forgotten, so that his name continues to be spoken, continues to be associated with a real person who had a real life, rather than fading into the abstract category of cold case or missing person or organized crime victim. Brian Carrick was a 17-year-old boy from Johnsburg, Illinois. He had a mother who loved him. He had a life that was his own, full of the specific ordinary things that make up a life. He was taken from the world by people who decided his life didn't matter. His life mattered. It matters now. Every time someone hears his name and says it out loud, every time his story is told and heard, every time someone finishes listening to this and carries Brian with them into the rest of their day, that is a small act of resistance against what was done to him, against the attempt to erase him. He cannot be erased. Not while people are still talking about him. Not while Mary is still looking for him. Not while there are people who refuse to let his name disappear into silence. There is a particular kind of justice that arrives too late to fix the thing that needed fixing, justice that is real, that is earned, that matters deeply, but that cannot reach back through the years and undo what was done. That is the justice this case produced. Real, hard-won, insufficient. By the time the convictions came, the organized crime network that had operated in McHenry County had been substantially dismantled. Scott Vig was in federal prison. The people around him, those who had planned Brian's death, carried it out, maintained the silence, faced their own consequences. The machinery that had protected them for years had been broken apart, piece by piece, through the patient, sustained work of federal investigators who refused to let the case go cold permanently. The broader legacy of the prosecutions that came out of the Henry County investigation was significant. Multiple individuals connected to the Chicago outfit's suburban operations were incarcerated. Illegal enterprises that had been running for years were shut down. The specific network that had made Brian Carrick's murder possible, and had made the concealment of it possible, no longer existed in any functional sense. But Brian was still missing. That fact sat at the center of everything else, unmoved by verdicts or sentences or the public acknowledgement that finally came. Every development in the legal case was framed for Mary, against that central immovable fact. Every step forward existed in the shadow of the one step that hadn't happened. In the years since the convictions, the case has continued to attract attention from people who care about missing persons, about organized crime accountability, about the specific injustice of a family denied the ability to bury their child. Investigators, journalists, advocates, people who look at the gap between legal resolution and human resolution and refuse to accept that the gap is permanent. The Chicago area's history with organized crime is long and documented. The outfit's story has been told in books and documentaries in courtrooms for decades. But embedded in that larger history are individual stories, specific people, specific lives, specific losses that resist being absorbed into the organizational narrative. Brian Carrick is one of those specific people. His story is not a footnote in the outfit's history. It is its own complete tragedy, its own irreplaceable loss, its own ongoing wound. He was 17 years old. He came from a working-class family in a small Illinois town. He got pulled into a world he didn't fully understand, and the people in that world decided he needed to die. Everything else, the investigation, the convictions, the sentences, is the world's response to that fact. An imperfect, incomplete, but Brian deserves to be found. His mother deserves to bury him. That need doesn't expire. It doesn't become less urgent with the passage of time. It stays alive the way love stays alive, the way grief stays alive, the way the truth stays alive no matter how hard anyone tries to bury it. Every story has to end somewhere. But some stories don't really end. They just reach the place where the telling stops while the living of them continues. Brian Carrick's story is one of those. The legal chapter is closed. The people responsible for his death were identified, charged, convicted, and sentenced. The silence that protected them for years was broken slowly, imperfectly. Through the grinding work of federal investigators and the testimony of people who eventually decided that talking was better than carrying what they knew indefinitely. The truth, in its legal form, is now part of the permanent record. But Brian is still out there somewhere. In the ground, in the cold Illinois landscape, in some location that the people who put him there have never fully disclosed. He has been missing for more than 20 years. He was 17 when they took him, and he has been gone ever since. Through every season, every year, every ordinary day that the world kept having without him, his mother has never stopped looking. That is the through line of this entire story. Not the organized crime, not the FBI investigation, not the courtroom proceedings, but a mother who refused to let her son become a forgotten name in a filing cabinet, who kept asking the question when the world had largely stopped listening, who held the truth of what happened to Brian long before the legal system caught up to it, and who held it alone for years before anyone with official power joined her in holding it. Mary Weaver is the real story here. Her love for Brian, her refusal to accept silence, her decades of pushing against a system and a community that stayed quiet too long. That is the human center of everything else. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when an ordinary person refuses to let an extraordinary injustice stand, it looks like her. It looks like phone calls and questions and never, ever accepting the comfortable lie that her son chose to disappear. He didn't choose anything. He was 17, and the choice was made for him by people who had no right to make it. Those people are in prison now. That matters, that is real. But Brian is still missing, and until he is found, the story is not complete. The wound is not closed. The family does not have what families are supposed to have when they lose someone they love. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Brian Carrick on December 20th, 2002, or about where his remains might be, please contact the FI Chicago Field Office or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons. He deserves to come home. Good night, everyone. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.